On the morning of June 14, 1943, the sun rose over a small farming community in rural Mississippi with the same golden warmth it had for generations. The air hung thick and heavy with humidity, carrying the sweet scent of magnolia blossoms from the trees lining the property's eastern border. 19-year-old Thomas Jackson stood in the fields of his family's modest farm, wiping sweat from his brow as he guided the old farmall tractor through rows of cotton. The plants had reached knee height, their leaves already showing the healthy green that promised a good harvest if the weather held and the boll weevils stayed away. The metal exhaust pipe rattled with every turn of the engine, a sound as familiar to him as his own heartbeat, creating a rhythmic percussion that had become the soundtrack to his daily labor. Thomas had been working since 5:30 that morning, wanting to complete the cultivation of the north field before the afternoon heat became unbearable. His shirt, already soaked through with perspiration, clung to his back as he maneuvered the tractor with the practiced ease of someone who had been operating such machinery since age 12. The steering wheel felt smooth under his calloused hands, worn down by years of use by multiple generations of Jackson farmers. Behind the tractor, the cultivator tines bit into the red Mississippi soil, turning over weeds and loosening the earth around the cotton plant's roots. Thomas believed this day would be like any other, another sunrise of back-breaking work under the unforgiving sun, another sunset of exhausted satisfaction. He had plans to help his father repair the barn roof that evening, work that had been postponed for 3 weeks due to the demands of the growing season. His mother had mentioned that the general store in town had received a shipment of sugar, a rare commodity in these wartime days of rationing, and she hoped Thomas might drive the truck into town later that week to secure their family's allocation. His younger brother, Marcus, only 14, was working the south field with the mule team, not yet trusted with the precious tractor, but learning the skills that would make him a capable farmer in his own right. He had no way of knowing that within hours, that very exhaust pipe, loosened by months of vibration and temporarily secured with wire, his father had twisted into place just 2 days prior, would become an unlikely weapon in a confrontation that would challenge everything he understood about courage, ingenuity, and the vast distance between his small corner of the world and the massive conflict raging across oceans. The wire fixing was typical of the Jackson family's approach to farm maintenance, making do with whatever materials were at hand, keeping equipment functional through cleverness and determination when replacement parts were unavailable or unaffordable. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Thomas Jackson would discover that day was that heroism required no uniform, no training, and no grand stage. Sometimes it emerged from the most ordinary of circumstances, transforming a simple farm boy with nothing but determination and a piece of agricultural equipment into an unlikely defender against an enemy he had only heard about in radio broadcasts and newspaper headlines. Thomas had been born in 1924 to sharecroppers who had worked the same red clay soil for as long as anyone could remember. His father, Samuel Jackson, had served briefly in the First World War, returning with stories that young Thomas had absorbed like the summer rain soaking into parched earth. The elder Jackson spoke of distant battlefields, of men from different worlds thrown together by circumstance, of technologies that seemed to belong more to science fiction than to reality. Samuel had been part of a labor battalion, one of the thousands of black soldiers who had served in support roles, loading supplies, building infrastructure, maintaining the vast logistical network that kept armies functioning. He had been in France during the final months of the conflict, had witnessed the arrival of tanks and aircraft, had seen the destruction modern warfare could inflict, but those stories had always felt impossibly remote to Thomas, separated from his daily existence by both geography and probability. The Jackson farm consisted of 67 acres of cotton and corn, land that Samuel had purchased in 1933 after years of sharecropping for white landowners. The acquisition of their own land had been a monumental achievement, representing decades of saving and sacrifice, of living frugally and planning carefully. The purchase had been possible only because the previous owner, Mr. William Henderson, had been willing to sell to a black family at a time when such transactions were rare and often opposed by the community. Henderson, a First World War veteran himself, had respected Samuel's service and character enough to facilitate the sale, despite social pressure to do otherwise. The property included a weathered farmhouse with a tin roof that sang during rainstorms, creating a music that Thomas had fallen asleep to since infancy. The house had been built in 1897, its heart pine timbers still solid despite decades of exposure to Mississippi weather. 3 bedrooms, a kitchen with a wood-burning stove, a parlor where the family gathered in the evenings to listen to the radio or read by lamplight. The floors creaked in familiar patterns, each board's voice as known to Thomas as the voices of his family members. His mother had made curtains from feed sacks, bleaching and dyeing the fabric to create cheerful patterns that brightened the rooms. There was also a collection of aging equipment that Samuel kept running through sheer determination and mechanical ingenuity. A mule-drawn plough that dated to before Thomas's birth, harnesses that had been mended so many times, they were more patch than original leather, hand tools whose handles had been replaced multiple times, while the metal heads continued their service. The Farmall tractor was the pride of the operation, purchased used in 1938 after 3 years of saving every spare penny. It represented freedom from the mule-drawn ploughs that had defined southern agriculture for generations, though it required constant maintenance and creative repairs to keep functioning. Samuel had taught Thomas everything about the tractor, had insisted his son learn not just how to operate it, but how to understand its mechanisms, how to diagnose problems by listening to engine sounds, how to fabricate repairs when proper parts were unavailable. They had rebuilt the carburetor together one winter, Samuel explaining each component's function while Thomas took notes in a careful hand. They had replaced the radiator the following summer after a crack developed, salvaging the part from a salvage yard 40 miles away and spending an entire weekend installing it. The tractor was more than machinery to the Jackson family. It was an investment in their future, a tool that made their farm viable, a symbol of progress and independence. On this particular morning, Thomas had risen before dawn as usual, dressing quietly in the bedroom he shared with Marcus, pulling on work clothes that his mother had washed and mended the previous evening. The house had been dark and silent, except for the familiar sounds of the building settling, the creak of floorboards, as he made his way to the kitchen where his mother was already preparing breakfast. Esther Jackson was always the first awake, starting the stove fire while the rest of the family still slept, preparing the meal that would fuel them through hours of physical labor. Breakfast had been cornbread and molasses, supplemented with eggs from the chickens that scratched in the yard behind the house. There had also been coffee, real coffee rather than the chicory blend many families had turned to as wartime shortages made the genuine article scarce. Samuel had connections at the general store through his service record, relationships built over years of fair dealing and mutual respect that sometimes resulted in small advantages, like access to coveted supplies. The family treasured such moments, understanding that they represented not just material benefits, but also the slow incremental progress toward full participation in American society. His younger sister, Grace, 16 years old and already taller than their mother, had teased him about the dance scheduled for that Saturday in town. The event was being organized by the local church, a social gathering meant to provide entertainment and normalcy in wartime. Young people from several surrounding communities would attend, including, Grace had mentioned with deliberate casualness, Mary Ellen Turner. Thomas and Mary Ellen had known each other since childhood, had attended the same small schoolhouse where education for black students ended at 8th grade. In recent months, their relationship had developed an unspoken complexity, glances held a moment longer than necessary, conversations that found excuses to extend themselves. Grace asked if he planned to finally work up the courage to speak to Mary Ellen beyond awkward hellos. Thomas had flushed, mumbling something non-committal while his mother hid a smile behind her coffee cup. His father had looked up from his own breakfast, eyes twinkling with amusement but saying nothing. Marcus had contributed an unhelpful comment about Thomas being sweet on Mary Ellen, earning himself a glare from his older brother and a gentle rebuke from their mother about minding his own business. Esther had then reminded Thomas to check the irrigation channels in the south field, where the crops had shown signs of water stress. The spring had been drier than usual, and careful management of their limited water resources had become crucial to the harvest. She had also mentioned that the garden behind the house needed weeding, work that Grace and Marcus would handle that afternoon. The garden provided vegetables that supplemented their diet and reduced their dependence on purchased goods, an important consideration in an era of rationing and limited cash income. Samuel had outlined his plans for the day, mentioning the barn roof repair that would require Thomas's help in the evening. One of the tin panels had come loose during a storm 2 weeks prior, and rainwater had begun damaging the stored hay. The repair had been postponed due to the urgent demands of the growing season, but it could not be delayed much longer without risking significant loss of feed for the mules and milk cow. Samuel had already scavenged replacement tin from an abandoned building on a neighboring property, had shaped and prepared the panel, and now needed only Thomas's assistance to climb onto the roof and secure it in place. The war in Europe and the Pacific felt as distant as the moon to most residents of their small Mississippi community. News arrived through radio broadcasts that the family gathered to hear each evening, through newspapers that were sometimes days old by the time they reached the general store, through occasional letters from young men who had gone off to serve. The conflict seemed to exist in a parallel world, one that touched their lives through rationing and worry, but remained fundamentally remote from the daily reality of farming. Thomas had registered for the draft the previous year when he turned 18, traveling to the county courthouse with his father to complete the necessary paperwork. The process had been segregated, black registrants processed separately from white ones, but Samuel had insisted on Thomas's compliance with the law despite the inequities built into the system. "Your country calls," Samuel had said quietly, "and we answer because we are Americans, even when America does not always treat us as such." Thomas had received his classification and waiting like millions of other young men to see if his number would be called. Several boys from the surrounding area had already gone to war, their departures marked by small ceremonies at church, by worried parents trying to maintain brave faces, by younger siblings uncertain about what it all meant. Robert Williams, Thomas's friend since childhood, had been among the first to leave, sent to training camp and then assigned to a quartermaster unit somewhere in North Africa. Robert's letters described a world utterly foreign to their rural Mississippi experience, cities ancient beyond American comprehension, heat that made Mississippi summers seem mild, military life with its rigid hierarchies and complex social dynamics. Another local boy, James Peterson, had gone into the Navy, his letters describing life aboard ship in the Pacific theater. He wrote of endless ocean stretches, of tropical islands, of food that was plentiful but monotonous, of the strange experience of living in such close quarters with hundreds of other men. His mother displayed his letters with pride, sharing excerpts with anyone who visited, though Thomas noticed she avoided reading the parts that hinted at danger or fear. The war had also touched their community through rationing. Sugar, coffee, gasoline, tires, meat, butter, and numerous other goods were now controlled through a system of ration books and stamps. Esther managed the family's rations with careful attention, planning meals that stretched their allocations, preserving vegetables from the garden, making substitutions when necessary. The black market existed, of course, with some people willing to pay inflated prices for unrationed goods, but Samuel had forbidden any participation in such activities. "We follow the law," he had stated firmly, "and we do our part, even when others choose not to." Gasoline rationing affected the farm's operations, limiting how much work could be done with the tractor versus the mules. Samuel had registered the farm for agricultural exemptions that provided additional fuel allocations, but he used every drop carefully, planning routes and tasks to minimize waste. The family's truck, a 1937 Ford that Samuel had purchased third-hand, sat unused except for essential trips to town for supplies or church on Sundays. But for now, Thomas remained on the farm, classified as essential agricultural labor, contributing to the war effort through the crops that would feed soldiers and civilians alike. The cotton they grew would become uniforms and tents, medical supplies and parachutes. The corn would feed livestock that would become protein for military kitchens. Thomas understood intellectually that his work mattered, that agriculture was genuinely essential to the war effort, but part of him felt guilty about not serving in uniform like Robert and James, about remaining safe at home while others faced danger overseas. Samuel had addressed this guilt directly one evening after Thomas had expressed his feelings. The war needs soldiers, his father had said, but it also needs farmers. A soldier with no food, with no cotton for his uniform, with no supplies reaching the front, cannot fight no matter how brave he might be. Do your work well, Thomas, and know that you are serving even if you never wear a uniform. The words had helped, though the guilt never entirely disappeared. Around mid-morning, as Thomas completed another pass through the cotton rows, the sun climbing toward its midday apex and the temperature rising into the 90s, he noticed something unusual in the sky. At first, he thought it might be one of the Army training planes from the airfield 50 miles to the east, Maxwell Field, where pilots learned to fly before being sent overseas. Such aircraft occasionally passed overhead, their engines creating distant rumbles that prompted farmers to pause and shield their eyes, watching the silver specks trace paths across the blue expanse. Samuel had taken Thomas to visit the airfield once, using connections through his veteran status to arrange a tour. And Thomas had been amazed by the rows of aircraft, by the young men in flight suits, by the sense of purpose and urgency that permeated the facility. But this aircraft was lower, much lower than the training planes usually flew when passing over farmland. Something about its profile seemed wrong, its silhouette not matching the familiar shapes Thomas had learned to recognize. The engine sound was different too, not the steady drone of the trainers, but a stuttering, irregular roar that spoke of mechanical distress. Thomas brought the tractor to a stop, killing the engine and climbing down to get a better view. The sudden silence, after hours of engine noise, felt profound. He could hear the wind rustling through the cotton plants, the distant call of a crow, and above it all the struggling engine of the descending aircraft. The aircraft was descending rapidly now, clearly experiencing severe difficulties. Black smoke trailed from its engine, not the thin exhaust he had seen from other planes, but thick, dark smoke that suggested serious damage. The aircraft wobbled uncertainly in the air, losing altitude with each passing second, the pilot clearly struggling to maintain control. As it drew closer, perhaps 500 feet above the fields, Thomas could make out details that sent a chill through him, despite the oppressive heat. The markings were unfamiliar, not the familiar star insignia of American planes, but something else. Shapes and colors that did not match anything Thomas had seen during his visit to Maxwell Field, or in the newsreels shown before feature films at the town's single movie theater. The design was sleeker, more aggressive than the training planes, with a profile he vaguely recognized from newsreel footage showing enemy aircraft in combat over Europe. The wings were straight rather than tapered, the fuselage lean and purposeful, the overall impression one of predatory efficiency even in its damaged, struggling state. Thomas felt his heart hammering against his ribs as his mind struggled to reconcile what his eyes were telling him with what logic insisted must be true. This was impossible, absolutely impossible. This was rural Mississippi, thousands of miles from any combat zone, separated from the war by entire oceans. How could an enemy aircraft possibly be here? How could such a thing penetrate so deep into American territory without being detected and intercepted? Had the war somehow come to Mississippi without warning? Were there other aircraft? Was this a scout for a larger formation? Thomas's thoughts raced through increasingly unlikely scenarios, his fear warring with disbelief. The aircraft continued its faltering descent, now perhaps 300 feet above the cotton field, low enough that Thomas could see the canopy, could make out the shadow of the pilot inside, could see the propeller spinning irregularly. The engine sound had become a grinding roar, metal components clearly failing, the machine fighting against its own imminent destruction. Thomas tracked its path, realizing it would pass directly over the Jackson property before crashing somewhere beyond the tree line that marked the western boundary. It passed overhead with a thunderous noise, close enough that Thomas instinctively ducked, despite the aircraft still being well above him. He felt the air pressure change, felt the heat radiating from the struggling engine, smelled burning oil and hot metal. Then it was past, disappearing behind the tree line with its nose dipping sharply toward the earth. Thomas heard the crash, a distant crumpling sound mixed with tearing metal and splintering wood, followed by an ominous silence that seemed to stretch for several heartbeats. Then he could hear the crackle of fire, could see smoke beginning to rise above the trees, black and thick and suggesting catastrophe. For several heartbeats, Thomas stood frozen in the cotton field, his work boots planted in the red soil, his entire body rigid with shock and uncertainty. Part of his mind insisted this could not be happening, that he must have misidentified the aircraft, that there must be some rational explanation that did not involve an enemy plane crashing on Jackson property. But the evidence before him, the unfamiliar markings he had clearly seen, the distinctive profile that matched newsreel images of German aircraft, made denial impossible. Then survival instinct and curiosity propelled him into motion. He began running toward the tree line, his work boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. His legs, strong from years of farm labor, carried him quickly across the field, but his mind was racing even faster. What would he find beyond those trees? Was the pilot alive, or had he perished in the crash? If alive, would he be injured, capable of movement? Would he be armed? Would he be hostile or defeated? The June heat pressed down like a physical weight, the humidity making each breath feel thick and labored. Thomas's shirt, already damp with sweat from the morning's work, became soaked as exertion, and adrenaline drove his body temperature higher. He could feel his pulse pounding in his temples, could hear the rush of blood in his ears, competing with the sound of his breathing and the thud of his boots against the earth. As he ran, Thomas tried to form a plan. He had no weapon beyond the pocket knife his father had given him for his 16th birthday, a useful tool for 100 farm tasks, but hardly adequate for confronting an armed enemy soldier. He had no radio to call for help, no way to contact authorities except by traveling to a telephone, and the nearest one was at the Henderson farm 3 miles away by road, perhaps 2 miles cutting through fields and woods, but still too far to be useful in an immediate crisis. Should he go for help rather than investigating? But what if the pilot was escaping, heading toward town or other populated areas where he might cause harm? What if there was time-sensitive information to be gained, intelligence that could prove valuable to authorities? Thomas had heard enough radio broadcasts about the importance of civilian vigilance, about citizens doing their part to maintain security, to feel that simply ignoring the crash would be a dereliction of duty. His father's stories from the First World War echoed in his mind, tales of courage and fear, of men making decisions in moments of crisis with incomplete information and insufficient preparation. Samuel had spoken of the importance of doing one's duty even when afraid, of acting rightly because it was right rather than because it was safe or easy. Thomas drew on those lessons now, letting them override the very reasonable fear that accompanied him toward the tree line. The undergrowth at the field's edge was thick with blackberry brambles, poison ivy, and wild grapevines that had reclaimed the border between cultivated land and forest. Thomas crashed through it, branches whipping at his arms and face, thorns catching on his clothing and skin. He barely registered the scratches and welts, his attention focused forward on what he might find in the clearing beyond. His breathing came in harsh gasps now, the combination of running, heat, and adrenaline pushing his body to its limits. The forest itself was second-growth pine and hardwood, trees perhaps 30 to 40 years old that had reclaimed land, cleared for cotton in the previous century, and then abandoned when soil exhaustion made farming uneconomical. Thomas had played in these woods as a child, had hunted squirrels and rabbits here with his father, knew the terrain as well as he knew the fields his family cultivated. That familiarity provided some comfort as he navigated toward where he estimated the aircraft had gone down. The crash site revealed itself as Thomas emerged into a small clearing. The aircraft had come down in a relatively controlled crash. Its landing gear collapsed, but the fuselage largely intact. It had plowed a furrow through the soft earth before coming to rest against an old oak tree. The black smoke he had seen from the field poured from the engine cowling, and the acrid smell of burning oil filled the air. The markings were now clearly visible, confirming Thomas's worst suspicion. This was a German aircraft, though how it had come to be here remained incomprehensible. As Thomas approached cautiously, movement caught his eye. The canopy slid back with a metallic screech, and a figure emerged, climbing awkwardly from the cockpit and dropping to the ground. The pilot was young, perhaps only a few years older than Thomas himself, with close-cropped blonde hair and a uniform that, despite the crash, retained an almost pristine quality. He looked around the clearing with an expression that combined disbelief, relief, and growing concern as he spotted Thomas. For a long moment, perhaps 30 seconds that felt like hours, the two young men stared at each other across 30 feet of Mississippi clearing. The contrast between them could hardly have been more stark. Thomas, in his sweat-soaked work clothes, face scratched from running through brambles, hands calloused from farm labor, standing in the forest of his family's property. Franz in his flight suit, despite the crash still bearing the marks of military precision, his uniform designed for a different purpose and climate, his posture that of a trained soldier even in defeat. The German pilot's hand moved toward the holster at his hip where his sidearm rested, then hesitated. His fingers touched the leather flap, but did not proceed to draw the weapon. Thomas could see the calculation in Franz's eyes, the assessment of threat and opportunity, the weighing of options. For his part, Thomas remained absolutely still, aware that any sudden movement might precipitate violence, understanding that this moment balanced on the edge of outcomes that could range from capture to combat. Franz spoke first, his English heavily accented but clear enough to understand, the words careful and measured. "Where is this place? What state?" The question struck Thomas as almost absurd given the circumstances, but he responded, his voice steadier than he felt. "Mississippi, United States of America. You crashed on my family's farm." The German's face registered a complex series of emotions in rapid succession: shock, disbelief, confusion, then something approaching despair. His hand dropped away from his sidearm as the implications sank in. "Mississippi," he repeated, as if saying the word might somehow change the reality. "That is impossible. We were over the Atlantic Ocean. We were conducting reconnaissance of the coastal regions. The navigation equipment must have malfunctioned more severely than I realized. I believed perhaps I had reached Georgia or Florida, somewhere near the coast. But Mississippi? That is so far inland. How is this possible?" Thomas had no answer to offer. He knew nothing of navigation or reconnaissance missions, could not explain how an aircraft could penetrate so deeply into American territory. He knew only that it had happened, that the evidence stood before him in the form of both the crashed aircraft and its pilot. "I do not know how you got here," Thomas said slowly, "but you are here. And that means you are far from any help, far from any friendly forces." Franz looked around the clearing as if expecting his circumstances to somehow change, as if the Mississippi forest might transform into something more familiar or less dire. When his gaze returned to Thomas, there was a new quality to his expression, a recognition of the reality he faced. "You are alone?" he asked. "There are no soldiers nearby? No military presence?" Thomas considered lying, considered claiming that armed forces were moments away, but something in Franz's bearing, perhaps the defeat already visible in his posture, suggested that honesty might serve better. "I am alone," he confirmed. "The nearest military installation is 50 miles from here, but my family will notice my absence eventually. And when that aircraft," he gestured toward the smoking wreckage, "when that is discovered, authorities will come. You cannot escape this." Franz actually laughed, though the sound held no humor. "Escape? Where would I escape to? I am thousands of miles from my homeland, in the middle of enemy territory, with no aircraft and no way to contact my command, even if such contact were possible. I am not thinking of escape. I am thinking of survival." The distinction seemed important, though Thomas was not entirely certain why. There was a difference, he supposed, between a dangerous enemy trying to evade capture and cause harm, and a defeated soldier simply trying to stay alive. The former required immediate action and force if necessary. The latter might admit of different possibilities. "What were you doing here?" Thomas asked, curiosity momentarily overriding caution. "Why was a German aircraft flying over Mississippi?" Franz hesitated, clearly weighing how much information to share. His training presumably included protocols about what to reveal if captured, limits on the intelligence that could be shared with the enemy. But his current circumstances, so far from anything resembling a standard military engagement, seemed to make those protocols feel distant and perhaps irrelevant. "Reconnaissance," he finally said. "Experimental long-range missions to test whether modified aircraft could gather intelligence deep in American territory. The concept was to prove feasibility, to demonstrate that American coastal defenses could be scouted and potentially bypassed. But as you can see, the experiment has not succeeded. The modifications to extend our range created mechanical vulnerabilities. Engine problems developed over the ocean. Navigation equipment failed. I've been flying on dead reckoning for hours, trying simply to find land, to survive long enough to set down somewhere. When I saw your fields, I thought perhaps it was a military training ground. Only when I crashed did I realize my error. The explanation made a certain grim sense. Thomas had read enough in newspapers and heard enough on radio broadcasts to know that both sides in the war were constantly testing new tactics, pushing technological boundaries, seeking advantages through innovation. That such experiments sometimes failed catastrophically was evident in the wreckage behind Franz. The smoke from the aircraft engine had become thicker now, and Thomas realized with sudden clarity that if the fuel ignited, the resulting explosion could be catastrophic. Small flames were visible through the smoke, licking at the cowling, working their way toward the fuel tanks. "Your plane is going to burn," Thomas said urgently, gesturing toward the smoking engine. "You need to move away from it. We both need to move away from it." Franz glanced back at the aircraft, and Thomas saw him assess the situation with professional competence. "Yes," he agreed, and began moving away from the wreckage, circling to maintain distance from Thomas, while heading toward the tree line on the far side of the clearing. Thomas mirrored his movement, keeping them roughly equidistant from the aircraft, but also ensuring that Franz's path would not take him back toward the Jackson farmland, where other family members might be at risk. As they moved, maintaining their wary distance, Thomas's mind continued to race through possibilities. He needed to prevent Franz from escaping into the surrounding countryside, where he could potentially cause harm or evade capture indefinitely. The forests and fields of rural Mississippi offered countless places to hide, and Franz, despite being foreign, could conceivably avoid detection for days or even weeks if he was resourceful and lucky. Local residents were not prepared for enemy soldiers in their midst, would not be vigilant against such a threat, because the threat itself seemed impossibly remote. But Thomas had no means to physically restrain an armed military pilot, no way to guarantee Franz's compliance beyond the pilot's own choice to cooperate. Force seemed inadvisable, given the disparity in training and weaponry. Persuasion might be possible, but would require Franz to decide that surrender was preferable to attempted escape. The situation remained balanced on an edge, capable of tipping toward violence or resolution, depending on choices both men made in the next few moments. Then Thomas remembered the tractor. It sat in the field on the other side of the tree line, perhaps 200 yards away. The exhaust pipe, he recalled, had been loose for days. His father had mentioned tightening it, but had been too busy with other repairs. If Thomas could reach the tractor and remove that exhaust pipe, he would have something that could serve as a makeshift weapon or tool. It was a desperate idea, but desperation seemed appropriate to the circumstances. Without warning, Thomas broke into a run, crashing back through the undergrowth toward the cotton field. Behind him, he heard Franz shout something in German, then the sound of pursuit. Thomas had grown up running through these woods, knew every root and branch, every dip and rise in the terrain. He used that knowledge now, choosing paths that would slow his pursuer while allowing him to maintain speed. He burst from the tree line into the cotton field with Franz perhaps 30 seconds behind him. The tractor sat where he had left it, its red paint faded by years of sun, its engine silent but still warm. Thomas reached it and immediately set to work on the exhaust pipe, his fingers fumbling with the bolts that held it in place. The metal was hot, burning his hands, but adrenaline made him push through the pain. Franz emerged from the trees as Thomas wrenched the exhaust pipe free. It was roughly 3 feet long, made of sturdy steel, heavy enough to be effective, but light enough to wield. Thomas turned to face the German pilot, holding his improvised weapon at ready. Franz had drawn his pistol, but he held it pointed at the ground rather than at Thomas. The two young men faced each other across the cotton rows, both breathing hard from the run, both clearly uncertain about what should happen next. The absurdity of the situation was not lost on either of them. An enemy pilot and a farm boy confronting each other with a gun and an exhaust pipe in a Mississippi cotton field, while war raged on the other side of the world. I do not wish to harm you, Franz said slowly, his accent making each word deliberate. But I cannot allow myself to be captured. You understand this? Thomas tightened his grip on the exhaust pipe. I understand you crashed on my land, he replied. I understand there is a war, and you are the enemy. And I understand that I cannot let you leave here to potentially hurt people in my community. The standoff continued, neither young man willing to make the first aggressive move. Sweat dripped into Thomas's eyes, and he could see Franz was similarly affected by the heat and stress. In the distance, Thomas could hear the normal sounds of the countryside, birds calling, the rustle of wind through the cotton plants. It all seemed impossibly peaceful given the circumstances. Then something shifted in Franz's expression. Perhaps it was exhaustion from hours of flying on failing systems. Perhaps the shock of finding himself so impossibly far from where he had intended to be. Perhaps a calculation that whatever military objective had brought him here was now irrelevant given the circumstances. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly, and his hand moved away from his holster definitively, no longer hovering near the weapon with threatening intent. He slowly lowered himself to one knee, his movements deliberate and non-threatening, then carefully unbuckled his holster and removed the entire assembly from his belt. He placed it on the ground before him, then straightened and raised his hands in the universal gesture of surrender. I surrender, he said quietly, his accent making the words almost formal. I am your prisoner. There is no point in resistance. You are correct that I cannot escape, and I do not wish to cause harm to civilians in attempting something futile. Thomas approached cautiously, his heart still hammering despite Franz's apparent submission. He kept his path angled, never moving directly toward the German, but rather spiraling in, maintaining maximum distance while closing the gap. Every muscle in his body remained tense, prepared to react if this was somehow a deception. But Franz remained motionless, hands raised, posture suggesting genuine defeat rather than tactical positioning. When Thomas reached the holster, he bent quickly to retrieve it, his eyes never leaving Franz. The weapon itself was a pistol, heavier than Thomas had expected when he lifted it, its metal warm from contact with Franz's body and from the heat of the day. Thomas had fired his father's old rifle while hunting, understood the basic principles of firearms, but had never held a military sidearm. The sense of deadly purpose it conveyed was palpable. The weight, not just physical but also moral, representing as it did the power to end life with a simple trigger pull. He examined it briefly, found what he believed was the safety mechanism, and ensured it was engaged, then tucked the weapon into his waistband at the small of his back, where it would be accessible but relatively secure. With Franz disarmed and compliant, Thomas allowed himself a moment to truly absorb what had just occurred. He, Thomas Jackson, 19-year-old farm boy with no military training or combat experience, had just taken custody of an enemy soldier on American soil. The improbability of it threatened to overwhelm him if he let himself dwell on it. We are going to walk to my house, Thomas said, his voice carrying more confidence than he felt. My mother will be there. We will call the authorities from a neighbor's telephone. Do you understand? Will you cooperate? Franz lowered his hands slowly. I understand, he replied. I will cooperate. I have no other rational option. But I ask that you treat me according to the conventions for prisoners of war. I am a soldier, not a criminal. I have attempted no harm to civilians. I simply wish to survive this situation. Thomas nodded, though he had only the vaguest understanding of what conventions Franz was referencing. He had heard mentions on radio broadcasts of the Geneva Conventions, of international agreements about treatment of prisoners, but the specifics were unknown to him. Still, his father's insistence on honorable conduct, on treating even enemies with basic human decency, provided guidance. You will not be mistreated, he said. We are not cruel people. Come on then. They began the trek across the field toward the distant farmhouse, Thomas staying several paces behind, the pistol now in his hand held with clear, if unpracticed intent. His mind was already racing ahead to the explanations he would need to provide, to the disbelief he would certainly encounter. Who would believe that an enemy aircraft had crashed on the Jackson farm? Who would believe that 19-year-old Thomas Jackson had captured a German pilot using nothing but a tractor's exhaust pipe and his own determination. As they walked, Franz spoke again, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity rather than threat. "The exhaust pipe you carried earlier," he said. "You were prepared to fight me with that? To use it as a weapon?" Thomas felt slightly foolish recalling his desperate improvisation, but he answered honestly. "If I had to, yes, it seemed better than nothing. Better than letting you leave and potentially threatening my family or neighbors." Franz actually laughed, though the sound was more rueful than mocking. "You Americans," he said, with something that might have been respect in his tone. "You are, I do not know the word, resourceful, determined. You see a problem and you solve it with whatever is at hand. It is not how we are trained to think. We are trained to follow procedures, to use proper equipment for each task. But you simply adapt. It is remarkable in its way." The comment struck Thomas as odd, this enemy soldier offering what seemed almost like admiration in the midst of his own capture. But perhaps it made sense. Franz was young, probably only a few years older than Thomas himself, and this bizarre situation had stripped away the usual protocols and expectations that governed military encounters. They were simply two young men navigating an unprecedented circumstance, doing their best to respond appropriately without clear guidance. The farmhouse came into view as they crested a slight rise in the field, and Thomas could see his mother on the front porch, shading her eyes with one hand as she watched their approach. Even from this distance, he could see her confusion in her posture, the way she leaned forward trying to understand why her son was walking across the field with a stranger, why he appeared to be carrying what looked like a weapon. Thomas knew the next few hours would be chaotic, filled with explanations and authorities and questions that would seem endless. But in this moment, walking across his family's land with a captured enemy pilot, he felt a strange sense of clarity. He had been presented with a challenge unlike anything his upbringing or experience had prepared him for, and he had responded. Whether he had responded perfectly or imperfectly would be for others to judge, but he had responded. He had done what seemed necessary in the moment, using what was available, acting according to values his parents had instilled. When they reached the house, Esther Jackson's initial alarm transformed quickly into a calm, practical response that would characterize the entire extraordinary afternoon. She listened to Thomas's rapid explanation, studied Franz with a mixture of caution and curiosity, then immediately sent young Grace running to the Henderson farm to telephone the sheriff. While they waited, she brought water for both young men, her hospitality instincts proving stronger than fear. The sheriff arrived within an hour, accompanied by two deputies and expressions of profound skepticism that evaporated immediately when they saw Franz in his flight suit and heard Thomas's account. The sheriff, a man named William Cartwright, who had known the Jackson family for years, listened with growing astonishment as Thomas described the crash and capture. His skepticism transformed to alarm when he considered the implications. An enemy aircraft penetrating American airspace, this deeply represented a security breach of serious proportions, regardless of whether it had been accidental or intentional. One of the deputies was sent immediately to verify the crash site, returning 20 minutes later with confirmation that yes, there was indeed a German aircraft, or what remained of one, in the woods beyond the Jackson property. The fuel tanks had exploded shortly after Thomas and Franz had left the clearing, the deputy reported, turning the wreckage into a burning ruin that would provide little intelligence value, but absolutely confirmed Thomas's story. Military authorities from Maxwell Field arrived by early evening, a convoy of vehicles carrying officers, intelligence personnel, and military police, who swarmed over the Jackson farm with the efficient purposefulness of people accustomed to crisis management. They cordoned off the crash site, began photographing and documenting everything despite the fire damage, and questioned both Thomas and Franz extensively. The questions for Thomas focused on exact timings, on what he had observed before and during the crash, on details of his interaction with Franz. The questions for Franz were conducted separately, and Thomas never learned their specific content, though he saw Franz led away to a vehicle and driven off toward the airfield as darkness fell. The aircraft was secured as much as possible given its damaged state, with guards posted overnight and plans made for its removal once proper equipment could be brought in. Intelligence officers examined what remained, photographing debris fields and making notes on clipboards, trying to extract whatever information might prove valuable about German aviation technology and long-range reconnaissance capabilities. The burned wreckage would eventually be transported to a facility where experts could conduct more thorough analysis. Franz was taken into custody and formally processed as a prisoner of war, beginning a journey through the POW system that would eventually see him housed at a camp in Texas for the remainder of the conflict. The camp would hold hundreds of German soldiers captured at various points during the war, most from the North African campaign or from submarine crews, though Franz's circumstances of capture would make him something of a curiosity among his fellow prisoners. His story of navigational failure and accidental deep penetration of American territory would be met with skepticism by some, but the evidence supported his account, and American authorities eventually concluded that the incident represented an ambitious experiment that had failed rather than a successful reconnaissance mission. Thomas himself became something of a local celebrity almost immediately. By the following morning, news of the incident had spread through the community, carried by those who had seen the military vehicles at the Jackson farm or heard from neighbors who had witnessed the commotion. The story grew in the telling, with various embellishments added, though the core facts remained accurate enough. Thomas Jackson had confronted and captured an enemy pilot, using farm equipment as an improvised weapon. In the days and weeks that followed, newspaper reporters came to interview the farm boy, who had captured an enemy pilot with a tractor's exhaust pipe. They arrived from the local weekly paper, from newspapers in Jackson and Memphis, eventually from as far as New York and Chicago. They photographed Thomas standing by the farm-oil tractor, asked him to reenact his run across the field, requested details about the confrontation. Thomas answered their questions with a combination of honesty and growing embarrassment, uncomfortable with the attention, but recognizing that the story had taken on a life beyond his control. The articles that resulted portrayed Thomas in heroic terms, emphasizing his quick thinking and courage. They dwelt on the symbolic resonance of a farm boy defending American soil with improvised weapons, seeing in the incident a metaphor for American resourcefulness and determination. Editorial writers used the story to make points about civilian preparedness, about the importance of vigilance even in seemingly secure locations, about the character of Americans who would confront danger rather than flee from it. Military officials commended Thomas's actions in formal ceremonies that he found deeply uncomfortable. He received letters of appreciation from officers at Maxwell Field, from state officials, eventually from members of Congress, who saw political value in associating themselves with the feel-good story. The local American Legion post made him an honorary member despite his youth, recognizing what they characterized as his defense of American territory. The story became one of those improbable but true tales that seemed to capture something essential about American character, about ordinary people rising to meet extraordinary circumstances. But for Thomas, the event prompted deeper reflection that the public celebrations could not quite capture. In the brief time he had spent with Franz before the authorities arrived, they had talked awkwardly at first, then with growing candor as shock gave way to something approaching normal human interaction. Esther Jackson, true to her nature, had brought water for both young men despite Grace's whispered protests that Franz was the enemy. "We do not mistreat people under our roof," Esther had said firmly, regardless of who they are or where they are from. "We are civilized people, and we will act like it." But for Thomas, the event prompted deeper reflection. In the brief time he had spent with Franz before the authorities arrived, they had talked awkwardly at first, then with growing candor. Franz spoke of his family in Germany, of a younger brother who hoped to become a doctor, of parents who farmed land not unlike the Jackson property. Thomas shared stories of his own family, of his plans after the war, of the community he was part of. In those conversations, the labels of enemy and ally became complicated by the simple recognition of shared humanity. Franz had asked Thomas why he had not simply let him go, why he had pursued him and confronted him rather than staying safe at a distance. Thomas had struggled to articulate an answer, finally settling on something that felt true even if incomplete. "This is my home," he had said. "These are my people. Letting you go might have put them in danger. I could not do that. and Franz had nodded, understanding in his expression. "I would do the same," he had replied quietly. "For my home. For my people." The war continued for more than 2 years after that June day in 1943. Thomas's number was eventually called, and he spent the final year of the conflict serving with an engineering battalion in Europe, helping to rebuild infrastructure in the wake of liberation. He saw cities reduced to rubble, populations displaced and suffering, the terrible cost of the conflict made visible in ways no newsreel could capture. After the war, Thomas returned to Mississippi and the family farm. He married Mary Ellen Turner in 1947, and together they raised 4 children on the same land where he had grown up. The Farmall tractor continued to serve for many years, though Thomas replaced the exhaust pipe shortly after the incident. He kept the original pipe, however, mounted on a wall in his workshop as a reminder of that extraordinary day. In 1952, Thomas received a letter from Germany. It had been forwarded through various military and diplomatic channels, and the return address showed it had originated from a small farming community outside Munich. The letter was from Franz Richter, who had returned to his family after being repatriated at war's end. Franz wrote of his gratitude for Thomas's honorable treatment of him as a prisoner, describing how that moment of human decency in the midst of conflict had helped him maintain faith in the possibility of peace. He wrote of his own return to farming, of his brother who had indeed become a doctor, of parents who had survived the war and were now grandparents. He asked if Thomas might be willing to correspond, to build a bridge of friendship across the divide that war had created. Thomas wrote back, beginning a correspondence that would last for decades. The 2 men exchanged letters describing their families, their farms, the challenges and joys of peacetime life. They shared photographs of children and grandchildren, discussed agricultural techniques and weather patterns, gradually constructed a relationship based on mutual respect and shared experience. They never met in person, circumstances and distance preventing it, but the connection they forged proved enduring. In 1987, Thomas attended a reunion of his old engineering battalion. During the event, a reporter conducting interviews about wartime experiences asked him to describe the most significant moment of his service. Thomas thought carefully before answering, considering the obvious choices such as the day his unit had helped liberate a concentration camp or the moment he had learned the war in Europe had ended. But his answer surprised the reporter. "The most significant moment," Thomas said, "was not during my military service at all. It was on my family's farm in Mississippi in 1943 when I faced an enemy pilot with nothing but a tractor's exhaust pipe. Because that was the moment I learned that courage is not about having the best weapons or the most training. It is about doing what needs to be done with whatever you have at hand. And it was also the moment I learned that even enemies are human beings, with families and hopes and fears just like our own." Thomas Jackson passed away in 2001 at the age of 77, surrounded by family on the same farm where he had been born and raised. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his wartime service, his dedication to family and community, and the remarkable story of the day he captured a German pilot using a tractor's exhaust pipe. But it also mentioned his decades-long friendship with that same former enemy, a relationship that his children described as one of the things their father was most proud of. The exhaust pipe remained mounted in the workshop, and after Thomas's death, his eldest son moved it to a small local history museum in town. It sits there now, accompanied by a plaque that tells the story, and by several of the letters exchanged between Thomas and Franz over the years. Museum visitors, especially school groups, often pause before the display, trying to imagine the scene it represents. A farm boy and a pilot, enemies by circumstance, meeting in a Mississippi cotton field on a June day when the world was at war. The story has been retold many times, in newspaper articles and local histories, in classroom lessons about the war. Each retelling tends to emphasize different aspects: the drama of the confrontation, the ingenuity of the improvised weapon, the improbability of an enemy aircraft crashing so far from any combat zone. But perhaps the most important part of the story is what came after: the friendship that grew from enmity, the recognition that the labels we apply to each other in times of conflict can be transcended by simple human connection. Thomas Jackson never considered himself a hero. In interviews later in life, he consistently downplayed his actions, insisting that he had simply done what the situation required. He pointed out that capturing an exhausted, disoriented pilot was hardly comparable to the genuine heroism displayed by soldiers in actual combat. But those who knew him understood that his humility was itself a form of courage, a refusal to let one dramatic moment define or inflate his sense of self. What Thomas had demonstrated that day was a particular kind of American virtue, one that exists somewhat independently of military might or technological superiority. It was the virtue of ordinary people confronting extraordinary circumstances with resourcefulness and determination. It was the ability to recognize that a tractor's exhaust pipe could become a weapon when necessary, but also the wisdom to understand that a former enemy could become a friend when circumstances allowed. The Jackson farm continues to operate today, now managed by Thomas's grandchildren. The cotton fields still flourish in the summer months, and the same red soil that Thomas worked as a young man still yields its crops. Modern tractors have long since replaced the old farmel, and contemporary farming techniques bear little resemblance to those of the 1940s. But the story of what happened there on June 14, 1943, remains part of the land's history, a reminder that even the most remote corners of the world were touched by the global conflict that defined the 20th century. For visitors to the crash site, now marked with a small memorial stone placed by the local historical society, it can be difficult to imagine the scene as Thomas described it. The clearing has grown over, reclaimed by nature. The oak tree against which the aircraft came to rest still stands, though it bears no obvious scars from the impact. On a quiet day, with only the sounds of birds and wind, the violence and drama of that long-ago morning seem impossible to reconcile with the peaceful surroundings. But that contrast is itself meaningful. It reminds us that war intrudes into peace, that the extraordinary erupts into the ordinary, that history is not just made on grand battlefields, but also in cotton fields and farm clearings. It reminds us that courage can manifest in a 19-year-old with no military training who chooses to confront rather than flee. It reminds us that a simple exhaust pipe, a piece of agricultural equipment, can become a symbol of resourcefulness and determination. Thomas Jackson's story also serves as a counterpoint to narratives that emphasize only technology and firepower in determining wartime outcomes. Here was a confrontation won not through superior weapons, but through local knowledge, quick thinking, and sheer determination. The German pilot had training, equipment, and a military tradition. Thomas had an intimate understanding of his own land, a willingness to improvise, and a clear sense of responsibility to his community. In that moment, those latter qualities proved decisive. The broader historical context of Franz Richter's mission, the experimental reconnaissance program that brought him over Mississippi, remains somewhat obscure. Military records from the period suggest that several such missions were attempted during 1943, testing the feasibility of long-range intelligence gathering. Most failed due to mechanical problems, navigation errors, or interception by American air defenses. Franz's mission represents one of the few instances where such an aircraft actually reached the American mainland, and certainly the only one known to have resulted in a crash so far inland. What this reveals is that even as late as 1943, military planners were still exploring unconventional approaches to intelligence gathering and strategic reconnaissance. The technology existed to potentially reach American soil, but the practical challenges made such missions extraordinarily risky, with minimal likelihood of success. Franz's survival and capture actually provided American intelligence with valuable information about these programs, helping to assess the level of threat they represented and to develop appropriate countermeasures. For Thomas Jackson, however, these larger strategic implications were less important than the immediate human reality. He had faced another young man in extraordinary circumstances and had responded with both courage and compassion. He had prevented a potential threat to his community while also recognizing the humanity of his enemy, and he had maintained those values throughout the rest of his life, refusing to let wartime enmity poison his capacity for connection and understanding. The letters between Thomas and Franz preserved now in the museum alongside the exhaust pipe, reveal the depth of the friendship that developed between them. They wrote about harvests and weather, about children's accomplishments and aging parents' health, about the small satisfactions and frustrations of daily life. Only occasionally did they reference their first meeting, and when they did, it was with a kind of bemused wonder at the improbability of it all. In one letter from 1968, Franz wrote about attending a reunion of his own former military unit. Many of the men had shared combat experiences, far more intense than his single reconnaissance mission, but when they asked about his most memorable moment from the war, he told them about the crash in Mississippi and the farm boy with the exhaust pipe. Some had laughed, thinking it a joke or exaggeration, but others had understood, recognizing in the story something essential about the arbitrary nature of survival and the possibility of connection even in conflict. Thomas's response to that letter expressed similar sentiments. He wrote about his own reunion experiences, about the bonds formed with men who had shared combat and hardship, but also about the particular significance of his connection with Franz. "We were enemies for one day," Thomas wrote, "and friends for decades since." There is a lesson in that, I think, about what persists after hatred fades. This exchange captures something important about the legacy of their encounter. In a war that caused immeasurable suffering and loss, that pitted ideologies against each other in mortal conflict, that demanded sacrifice from entire generations, here was a moment where two individuals transcended the roles assigned to them. They did not deny the reality of the war or the legitimacy of their respective sides, but they also refused to let those realities be the final word on their relationship. The modern world has inherited both the triumphs and traumas of the Second World War. We live with the geopolitical arrangements it established, the technologies it accelerated, the memories it seared into collective consciousness. Stories like Thomas Jackson's offer a different kind of inheritance, one that suggests human decency and connection can survive even the most devastating conflicts. They remind us that behind every uniform, every flag, every national identity, there are individuals with interior lives as complex as our own. When Thomas's children and grandchildren gathered after his death to sort through his belongings, they found the letters from Franz carefully preserved in a wooden box. They found photographs and small mementos exchanged over the years. They found evidence of a friendship that had been quiet but profound, maintained through handwritten correspondence in an age increasingly dominated by faster but more impersonal forms of communication. And they understood that this friendship had been, in its own way, as significant to their father as any of his more publicly celebrated accomplishments. The exhaust pipe in the museum has become something of a local touchstone, a physical artifact that connects visitors to history in a tangible way. School groups visiting the museum are encouraged to hold it, to feel its weight, to imagine using it as Thomas did. Teachers use it as a starting point for discussions about resourcefulness, about courage, about the American home front during the war. Some visitors, especially veterans, stand before it in quiet reflection, perhaps seeing in it a symbol of all the improvised solutions and desperate moments that define actual combat experience. What Thomas Jackson could not have known on that June morning in 1943 was that his actions would resonate beyond his own lifetime, would become part of the historical record, would teach lessons to generations not yet born. He acted in the moment, responding to circumstances with the resources available and a clear sense of duty. That his actions would later be celebrated was not his concern. He simply did what he believed was necessary. This quality, the ability to act rightly without concern for recognition or reward, may be the most enduring lesson of Thomas's story. In an age increasingly characterized by performance and public image, by actions taken primarily for their potential to generate attention, there is something refreshing about a person who simply did his duty because it was his duty. Thomas captured an enemy pilot not for glory, but to protect his community. He treated that pilot with basic human decency, not for praise, but because it was the right thing to do. He maintained a friendship with his former enemy, not to make a political statement, but because he had discovered a person worthy of respect and affection. The world of 1943 seems in many ways impossibly distant from our present moment. The technologies have changed, the geopolitical landscape has transformed, the cultural assumptions have shifted. But human nature remains recognizable across that temporal divide. We still struggle with questions of duty and courage, with decisions about when to fight and when to show mercy, with the challenge of seeing past labels to recognize shared humanity. Thomas Jackson's story speaks to these enduring questions, offering not prescriptive answers, but an example of one person's response to an extraordinary moment. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.